In today's Bloomberg Equality, our ongoing conversation about the bottom line impact of diversity, Wendy Holmes, UBS Global Wealth Management Private Wealth Advisor, joins us to discuss the latest UBS's Own Your Worth report, which shows that, well, interestingly, Wendy, the pandemic may have left women more engaged in their long-term financial goals. Are they taking more ownership, therefore, over the decision-making?
Hi, and thanks so much for having me to talk about this. You know, it's interesting because although we've maybe had some more time to talk about in our own homes what's going on from a financial perspective, women have generally abdicated that responsibility. And what the research has found is that younger women, actually millennials, are abdicating in greater numbers. The pandemic, on one hand, has given us a chance to spend more time and maybe put this on the list of things that we need to be addressing or talking about. But because we're so entrenched in our gender roles, whether it's homeschooling, housework, et cetera, we're actually finding that maybe we're not having the conversation as much as we should.
So, Wendy, within this study and within this breakdown that you're looking at between men and women, which we have up on the screen right now, are there also sort of data that you have that shows any sort of differences between, say, whites and blacks and other sort of ethnicities?
So it is found that women of color tend to abdicate more, as well as younger women. And I think it speaks to, you know, the impact of this pandemic on everyone in the working world, but also on families where we have women that are essentially taking on more and more responsibility. So the research does show that.
Wendy, it's very interesting that in your report it talks about millennial women really deferring a lot of those long-term financial decisions, which is curious to me because I keep hearing statistics about millennials really wanting to take an active participation in some of the climate change or ESG strategies. Why then, on the flip side of that, are you hearing that a lot of millennials are still deferring some of those long-term financial decisions?
You know, I found it so surprising because I think men and women agree, and actually 97% of the men that responded to the survey agree that this is one of the most important topics for equality, is financial equality, is empowerment. Yet the millennial women that we spoke with were actually abdicating in greater numbers. Now, they said that it was in fact due to, they assume that their spouse or their partner may be better suited to deal with it or may have more knowledge. They're uncomfortable. They don't want to have the conversation. So one of the things that we do within UBS and why this is such a focus is to start having those conversations much earlier, right? If you're in a household where you see both parents engaged in the topic of long-term financial goal, you're more likely to consider that to be something that you should be doing as well. And you know what's interesting is that we don't feel this is a segment. This isn't an initiative. This is half the population. And if we're not doing it now, and if the advisors aren't doing it and the firms aren't doing it, you know, we're complicit in the problem continuing.
Because I think that's sort of part of the problem that the statistics are bearing out. The chart we were just seeing before, Wendy, that shows that when asked, people are still saying, well, most of the yard work, or I'd say the garden work, is done by the men, and most of the cooking and the cleaning is done by the women. It feels like we're looking at something from the 50s instead of now. But what's interesting is you're saying the stereotypes actually aren't that obvious. When you're talking to the women in your survey, they're quite often the breadwinners in terms of the job. They've got high-end degrees. They're like, over here, Taylor doing her now master's in finance, not only her 3 CFAs. So they are people who are empowered from an education perspective. It just then seems so odd that they're not willing to take the financial decision making. Is there anything that UBS is doing to ensure that they make it more sort of enticing and enjoying to do?
Absolutely. You know, it's about having a seat at the money table. And I think one of the analogies I always like to think of, we work with very successful women. They're entrepreneurs. They're in starting businesses, selling businesses. But when it comes to talking about their own financial long-term well-being, they're almost apologizing that they don't seem to follow or get it. And it's a very interesting dynamic. I think we like to, what I like to work with clients is say, put your oxygen mask on first, right? If you don't understand it and if you're not engaged in it, you can't help anybody. And really it's about learning before you get to the point where you're in crisis, whether it's death of a loved one, divorce, et cetera, pandemic, where you're looking at accessing capital that perhaps you weren't to meet daily spending, putting your oxygen mask on first. what UBS is focused on doing is ensuring that we're having the conversation with all members of the family. I think, we have a lot of adult children who are home spending time with parents. It's a great time to sit down as a family and talk about what's the legacy for your children? What's important to you? What do you want to pass on?
Yeah.